Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 8th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Mochik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and I am moderating the technology track today, our first of 2 days of this conference. And assisting me today is Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System. Thank you, Jean. And we're both very glad to have you here with us. Our second presentation in the technology track is on website accessibility with Laura Solomon. Laura has presented for this conference a few times before. We're glad to have her back. And she is the Library Services Manager for OPLIN, the Ohio Public Library Information Network. So Laura, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. Yes, please do keep that questions box open, particularly because I'm helping to keep an eye on it. And I actually really enjoy taking questions as they come up. You do not have to wait until the very end. In fact, it's easier for me to kind of interrupt myself and talk about whatever it is you ask about at the time that we're all kind of talking about it, talk about things in context. So feel free to interrupt me because you're not really interrupting. We'll do it and move on. I have a lot to cover today, and the first thing I want to do is I want to give you some disclaimers, because anytime that I have done this session, sometimes I need to kind of manage expectations. First of all, there's only an hour, and the subject of accessibility for websites is extensive and long and deep. So there is a whole lot more. So what I'm going to be giving you today are some basics that you can start with. But if you were expecting, for example, an in-depth discussion of, say, ARIA roles, we're not going to even be touching on those today. That's just far beyond the scope of the time that we have. So that's why this is called an introduction to website accessibility. A few other things I want to share with you. Maybe you're familiar with this acronym. You might have seen it before. It's all over the web. It stands for I am not a lawyer. And we will be touching on some legal stuff today. But I want to also make this clear, you probably already knew that, I wasn't a lawyer, but sometimes people will ask very specific case questions that are simply not things that I can talk about. And frankly, even if I were a lawyer, I would not be one probably in the state that you're from, because I'm from Ohio. So if you have something that specific, you probably need to run that by your library's legal counsel specifically. The other part of this, and we'll be talking about this extensively, is that frankly, the law around web accessibility is just not clear. It's being defined on a nearly daily basis. We're going to talk more about that, which is another reason why you need to talk to your legal counsel. From the perspective of what I do in terms of web accessibility, my title is Library Services Manager, and I'm always fond of telling the story about how that title precedes me and my job at OPLIN, because it belonged to a person who does nothing with web development, and changing the title in a state agency is very difficult. So I have kept the title, even though really what I do is I'm a web developer. That's really my day-to-day job. So I am primarily a code geek here for most practical purposes, and I'm going to be telling you a good bit about that later on as well. I'm also, my last disclaimer, folks, I am not perfect either. I am trying to learn more every day about this, but like I said, it's long and wide as a subject. So yes, I have sites that are not perfect. We try really hard. In fact, and I'll talk about this week at the standards, we try to release our sites to our clients at the highest possible level of web accessibility standards. But I can't always guarantee what's going to happen to that site once someone else takes control of it. We'll talk more about that too. So just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going today, here's our agenda. We've broken this down into kind of three broad areas. We're going to start with, of course, foundations, right? So we're going to talk about why accessibility matters, and here's what it is, and why you need to do it, because this is still something very much that's new, I find, for a lot of libraries, unfortunately. It's not just libraries. We'll talk more about that also. We're going to talk also about standards and about validators. And this is where you're going to get kind of into the meat and potatoes of how do we know if our website is actually accessible or not, and what standards should we even be looking at. And then the last section, I'm going to give you some basic code examples. Now, don't get scared. I've done this many times. There are folks who have never seen any HTML. Unlikely, honestly, for a lot of folks in library land. In my own experience, they've at least seen it. None of it's that difficult to understand. HTML is a very simple little markup language. And at the very least, you're going to be able to take this back to whomever is in charge of your website and show this to them and say, hey, Laura said we should do this. Even if you don't understand all of the ins and outs of the example I'm showing you, it's okay. At least you're going to have that information. Okay, so moving on to section number 1. Again, I've got one eye on that question box, so if something comes up, feel free to ask it right away. You don't have to wait. So let's talk about the useful and the scary. And yes, this section is where we're also going to be talking about some of the legal stuff involved in web accessibility and how that affects libraries or doesn't. So the very first thing we have to talk about, because this is the foundation section, right, is what is web accessibility? So web accessibility as a definition is typically defined by the Web Accessibility Initiative part of the W3C. Here's a lot more. We love acronyms in library land, but tech has a ton too. So the World Wide Web Consortium is W3C. That's like the big international body that basically rules everything that goes on online. You may not even have been aware that they're there, but they are behind an awful lot of what happens on your online experience. And one of the things that they also manage is the WAI. So their definition is this, down on the bottom of the slide. I'm going to read it because I want you to think about this very carefully because there's something going on here you may not have realized. Web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. People will often gloss over this particular definition and not grasp that it's actually somewhat convoluted, because the very first thing that it says is web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies, but we call it web accessibility. So the piece that I want you to kind of latch on to here is that web accessibility is actually a very broad term that covers not just websites. Even the WAI agrees it's not just websites. This covers apps, it covers e-readers, it covers everything that basically is digital, even though it's called web accessibility. So if you were to go looking, say, standards for e-readers, it's not really going to be different because this is an umbrella term. So I want you to be aware of that when you start doing your own research so you don't get confused. The other thing that folks may not realize, because there is such a heavy emphasis on the blind and visually impaired, is that web accessibility applies to all kinds of disabilities. It's much more prevalent to gear things specifically for the blind or visually impaired because it's sort of the most obvious disability when it comes to the web, but it is not the only one. Web accessibility is about making it so your website or your tool or whatever can be used by the maximum number of people as it is. You want to make it comfortable, say, also for the elderly, as well as making it compatible with different types of assistive technology. And one of the bonuses that you get out of making your site accessible is that a lot of those types of changes also can help people with other things that are not actually accessibility related. So like, for example, people who have low bandwidth can benefit from some of these changes. People who are browsing with their graphics turned off, you may not be able to imagine that for yourself, but people do. They want a faster connection. Like, I don't need the graphics, I just want the information. A lot of these kinds of changes can actually benefit those types of users. Now, this is also from the W3C, and I just put this up here to, again, kind of drive home the point. Web accessibility is all kinds of accessibility. The W3C breaks it down into 6 different kinds. We're really today looking primarily, again, at visual. We have an hour, and this is where, honestly, where a lot of lawsuits happen. It's not the only place, but it's one of the major places is that subcategory of disability. And it's where the most questions often get asked. So we're going to be focusing on that today. But again, you know, if you find out your site is perfect, for example, unlikely, but perfect for fully blind users, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's perfectly okay for everybody else with any other kind of disability. So keep that at the back of your head. One thing that can get a little confusing in the web world is this kind of fine line between accessibility and usability. It doesn't help that they kind of look and sound alike either. So accessibility is related, but it is not the same as usability. Usability refers to the ability of average users with and I'm making quote signs. You can't see me, but I am. The standard, in quotes, range of equipment or abilities or to navigate and use a website. That's really what usability is. But in most cases, accessibility standards also add usability to a website. But accessibility consists of more than just general usability. So there is a lot of overlap. But as it says there on the slide, a site can be one of these things and not the other thing, or it can be both of these things. It can be usable and accessible. So there is overlap, but not the same. So if your site has, if you've been doing usability testing, for example, with your library's website, and it's coming out great, that's wonderful, but that is not at all the same as doing accessibility testing or validation. Okay, so let's get to the part that makes everybody cringe. And that's the legal issues, right? This is the part where it gets a little scary. I was talking to Jean and to Jamie earlier, and I said, one of the caveats I don't normally give is that, you're probably going to want to cry after this, but let's get through this. Obviously, we as library folks, we want our library websites to be as accessible as possible, right? We're all about serving our communities. No library wants to intentionally shut out a portion of that community. I've never ever heard that from a library, and I don't anticipate that I ever would. And while that's a lofty, admirable goal, right, there's also some more concerning reasons that your library has to start paying attention to this. So let's talk about what's been happening on the legal front. So for decades, lawyers for the disabled have used the Americans with Disabilities Act to force businesses to make their spaces more physically accessible, by adding ramps and widening doorways and lowering countertops and those kinds of things. And a good question from Carla, are libraries required to be both? From a legal standpoint, so here's spoiler alert, no, you're not required to be both. Legally, you're probably required to be accessible. You're not legally required to be usable. That might give you another defining line there. So, we've been doing all kinds of things to physical buildings for a long time based on the ADA. But, we've had the steady migration of pretty much everything, commerce, shopping, culture, to the internet, right? Everything's on the internet. We jokingly say that sometimes, but it's really become the truth. Think about how different your life was before and after the internet and everything you do on the internet now. So this has given a rise to a whole new flood of litigation because as all of this stuff has moved online, we haven't necessarily taken everybody with us. And so, the accessibility of websites to the visually impaired, those kinds of lawsuits have skyrocketed. The number of those kinds of lawsuits nationwide nearly tripled in 2018 over 2017. I don't have 2019 stats yet, but I figure they're probably even higher. This is just a sampling of companies that were dealing with lawsuits. Some of them may still be dealing with those lawsuits not too long ago. And there's a lot of really big companies in there. And of course, they're really easy targets because, well, they're really big companies and they likely have a lot of money. It's not just big companies, though. In just December of 2018 alone, 50 colleges were hit with these kinds of lawsuits. And litigation is increasing, experts say, because the Justice Department has declined to offer any kind of real guidelines or standards for what companies or organizations need to do to be considered accessible. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. So the Justice Department has not helped this matter at all. So what that means is that people who are disabled who can't access this kind of service or information can't say, oh, well, the Justice Department said you're supposed to do this. They have to go straight to a lawsuit. There's not a whole lot of recourse for them, to be honest. So what about libraries? I want to talk about a couple different cases because you might think, oh, well, libraries are okay. We haven't been sued. Nope, you're wrong. They have been, and they will continue to be. So probably the most well-known case, or maybe the earliest well-known case, happened in 2012 when the National Federation of the Blind sued the Free Library of Philadelphia on behalf of 4 blind patrons who were unable to use non-compliant Nook e-readers that the library provided. Remember, web accessibility doesn't cover just websites. So that's why I wanted to kind of hammer that point in, because the National Federation for the Blind won this case. And to settle that suit, the library agreed to purchase 10 new accessible e-readers and to ensure that all its e-readers were accessible within 4 years. So not a terrible penalty, but it was a lesson learned for them, that all services, especially technology-related services, should be accessible, because if they're not, you could be, of course, the unwilling participant in a lawsuit. This one actually, whoop, I think I forgot a slide here. I did. Okay, hang on a second. I'm going to tell you about another case. It's all right. There wasn't much to see on that slide. So let me tell you about another case that's even more important. And it was called Payen versus Los Angeles Community College District. It happened just this past summer. So what happened was that the Los Angeles Community College District was successfully sued. In other words, they lost, because the court ruled that they didn't adequately offer resources. And this was a very broad decision. They said that the library didn't adequately offer resources in technology at all to students that were 100% compliant with accessibility guidelines. And this happened in California, obviously. So what the library had to do is they had to meet what's the WCAG 2.0 AA level of standard. I'm going to talk about that in the next section. So don't worry yourself too much about what that is yet, but it is a specific standard that they have to meet for all the things that are offered and licensed through their consortium. So that, again, not just a website. This could be databases. It could be streaming services. It could be anything, just about. And there were some other things that they had to do, and it also became a problem because the court found that some vendors that say they're in compliance are not actually in compliance. And so the library is now responsible for testing all of that. That's another piece of this that may be of some concern, because we may take our vendor's word that something is wrong or not wrong, and then find out that in fact that it is. So this could be a very far-reaching decision. Again, it only affects this college right now, or probably, it's freaked out a lot of organizations in California. But one of the things you have to remember about law is that law is often defined in the court. So the more of these things that happen, the more likely it is this is eventually going to be far-reaching enough to be something where other lawyers go, well, look what happened in California, and maybe you're in Wisconsin or New Jersey. So I mentioned the Department of Justice before, and about how, frankly, unhelpful they've really been to this whole process. So the Americans with Disabilities Act already required websites to be accessible to disabled users. This has been well established in U.S. courts. It's not new. And in fact, in just last year, Domino's Pizza went to the Supreme Court and said, we don't want to have an accessible website. And the Supreme Court said, well, too bad, so sad, you got to have one. But in other words, the courts and the Department of Justice, with this statement in particular, have made their position clear that an accessible website is required under the ADA. So, basically they're just restating in this statement that they made in September 2018, they're just saying what they've been saying all along, which is, well, you better darn well have an accessible website. The law says so. But the problem with that is that it's not real clear how. I'm going to talk more about that. They say you should have it, but they're not giving you a whole lot of instructions about what that actually means. So another thing to consider, I'm sure if you're here today, you recognize the importance of accessibility, but often, many of us, honestly, are often overwhelmed by the idea of executing on it. And hang on a second, I saw a question scroll by, and my question box is very tiny, and I'm not sure I can see the whole question. So I'm going to ask Jamie.
Yeah, I'm here. The question is, so how much of this checking for databases and vendors should be on the responsibility of libraries versus a library system? So in Wisconsin, we have, as you know, Laura, I work for a public library system. All libraries are part of a system.
Okay, so in Ohio, we have, I think it's somewhat similar, but we have libraries and we have consortiums. And that might be a similar model.
Yeah, I
So,
think. Mhm.
okay, so again, this is something, unfortunately, where I am not a lawyer. What I can tell you is that in the Los Angeles Community College District's case, the court specifically said it was on them. Now, whether or not that's fair and whether or not they decided to fight that, I don't know. I suspect that they didn't. They just said, we're just going to test it because we don't want to go back to court. If I were them, that's probably what my response would be. So, you know, it's hard for me to answer that question because I don't know how a court in, say, Wisconsin or Nebraska would apply that particular philosophy. I'm not sure it's fair, honestly, because if a vendor says, yes, we're compliant, it seems to me like it should be the vendor. At the very least, you should be going back to the vendor and say, hey, look, you know, it says right here that you're accessible. Why aren't you? I'd be putting it back on the vendor pretty darn quick, but I can't definitively answer that question about who should be doing the testing because it looks like, at least from a legal standpoint, it's probably going to be case dependent.
I think it's something that we're going to have to start talking about if we have, you know, it's something we'll have to look at. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks for reading that to me. The box just got too small for me to see the whole thing.
No problem.
So we often get overwhelmed, you know, by this whole idea of instituting this, and then of course, you know, with like questions that was just asked, and what we were just talking about, Jamie and I, and you know how this is something you're going to have to look at. This gets, I'll be honest, it makes people cringy, and it makes me cringy. One of the reasons I try to stay on top of it because, you know, I don't want one of my clients to be in court because their site isn't accessible. You know, so but as a result, because this can be somewhat of a difficult topic and it's messy. That's the part that makes this really hard, right? You know, is that we kind of forget about the people who are impacted when these things are not accessible. And this quote is from a woman named Deb Chatra, who reappropriated Clark's third law, if you're familiar with that. But any sufficiently advanced neglect is indistinguishable from malice. And unfortunately, that becomes the premise of many legal cases, because you may not have meant to not include someone in your service or made it inaccessible to them. In fact, like I said, I don't know any library that would ever do that on purpose. But unfortunately, when it comes to the courts, it doesn't matter what your intent is what actually happened. Okay, so let's move on to standards and validators. Now that we know that we really probably do need to be, in order to comply with the law, we've got to do something, right? We've got that part. The question now becomes, what do we do? So let's talk about the two standards that exist. There are two. They're very different, and one or both may apply to you depending on what kind of library you are and what kind of funding you get. So the first one, and this gets confusing too, because people assume Section 508, which is the US standard, by the way, is part of the ADA. It's not. It's actually part of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. It is not actually part of the ADA. So people are like, it's part of the ADA. It's not. It's not. It gets confusing, I know, but it's not. So Section 508, like it says there, it is US only standard, and it is the bare minimum. It is like the least amount you should be doing. And the other one that I'm going to talk more extensively about is, again, from the World Wide Web Consortium. It's from the W3C. So this is the international standard, and there's a lot more to it and has different levels of compliance. So let me break these down a little bit and about why you should care about the differences. So Section 508 is like better than nothing, I guess, is what I would tell you. So Section 504 of the same act, by the way, prevents any organization that receives federal funding from discriminating against people with disabilities, and which, by the way, was core to that National Federation for the Blind lawsuit in Philadelphia. And that because the Free Library in Philadelphia got federal assistance. But Section 508 ensures that federal agencies provide the same level of access to online information to all people, regardless of disability. So we always talk about Section 508, but in fact, it may be Section 504 that applies to you regardless. So if you are a federal agency or you get federal money, you absolutely need to at least be doing Section 508. And I saw another question come in. Is there an onus on the web developer, an onus on the web developer or paid third-party vendor developing a site to create formats for their clients? If you contract for it, yes. But as we sort of kind of danced around a little bit ago, and that's a good question, I should be, yes, but I'm also very conscious of it, and I work for public libraries. I also have known people who are blind who use the web. So, and in fact, I worked for a time at Cleveland Public Library where they have a library for the blind and physically handicapped, and that really woke me up to a lot of this. So there is an onus on me personally, but from a legal standpoint, frankly, if you were to say contract with me as an independent consultant, not in my regular job, and say, hey, Laura, build me a website, unless you pay me to, no, there's not. That's up to you. You have to ask for it. Good question. So Section 508, if you are getting money or you are a federal agency, you have to at least do this. That's where this one comes in. But like I said, it's kind of the least you can do. The one that matters, and frankly, from the legal standpoint, again, where all the courts, not the Philadelphia case, because that's not what their prosecutor decided to base the case on, but many other cases, this is the one lawyers will talk to you about, which is the WCAG, the Worldwide Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's currently in version 2.0, and it has 3 levels of compliance. And the thing is about either the ADA or either section of the Rehabilitation Act that 508, 504 is based on, neither of those explicitly address how entities should provide equal access on their websites. So what the W3C did is they created the standard, again, much more comprehensive, more difficult to meet. And so this is the one that most courts will refer to. And so if you say, well, Laura, which one should I do? Because this is all begs that question, right? Well, Laura, should we do 508 or should we do W3C? If you're just starting out, my best advice to you is to start with 508, simply because it's easier to meet and it will introduce you to the idea of making a site accessible. There is a little bit of overlap between Section 508 and the WCAG. So, you know, it's not like you will hurt yourself or have to necessarily replicate all your work. You know, it's a good place to start. And obviously, again, if you're a federal agency or you get federal money, you have to at least do 508. But I encourage you to go to the higher road here, so to speak, and try to manage W3C compliance, because if frankly, if the thing that's driving you isn't service to your customers, it's lawsuits, this is where you need to be. Sometimes fear is a great motivator, but this is probably where you should start. Also, some of you may not be aware, this has actually been around for 10 years, a little more now, I guess. The ALA actually has a whole statement here about purchasing accessible electronic resources. And I know someone asked a little earlier about, you know, how much testing and stuff. This might be a good place to at least see where ALA stands on some of that. I don't know how updated it would be to deal with that specific question. But this does encourage librarians to require that their vendors provide accessible products, specifically, I can talk, those that meet the standards of Section 508 as well as the WCAG. And they give you a toolkit of questions that librarians can ask their vendors regarding, you know, compliance with those standards. So again, you know, sometimes we can only just take what vendors say and run with it, but at the very least, maybe you can get them to say it. And if you don't ask, they probably won't. So let's talk about automated checkers. And here's my favorite, actually. So actually, there's a list. I'm going to give you a URL at the very end. It'll be on the last slide, a list of resources where you can get even more of these. A-Checker just happens to be the one I use most often, and I'll show you why in just a second. But the first thing I have to talk about with automated checkers, when you're checking against these standards, is you have to understand that they are automated checkers, folks. They are not real live test subjects. What happens here is something where you get a printout that says, okay, here are the problems on your website, and here's where they are, and here's some more information to help you dig into how to fix it. but it is not the same thing as someone who is a live human being using your website. And I'll tell you, when I worked at Cleveland Public Library, that was a real eye-opener, and that really woke me up to the idea that these checkers are not the end-all be-all. If you have the ability to even work with one person who's even partially blind, all the way blind, something, has some, or even other kinds of disabilities, that is a far better test in many ways than these checkers. These checkers protect you, but they are not, if you're truly going for service, you know, if your main driver, frankly, isn't a legal problem, get a person. These are a start. But I also realize you can't always get a person. We've tried since I've come to Oakland. It is actually very difficult sometimes to get specific people to test your website, even with the Library for the Blind up in Cleveland. So anyway, this is achecker.ca. So let me talk a little bit about this one and why I like this one, but it is not the only one, and you may have a completely different preference. So my favorite thing about this, first of all, is you can just, as you can see here on the screenshot, you can just feed it a URL and it will check it. But you can also tell it to check against specific standards, which you can see kind of on the lower part of that screenshot. Like, for example, you can see section 508, but you can also see the different levels. Now, it still tests against WCAG 1.0. Don't even bother with that. We're at 2.0. But you can see that it checks against the 3 levels of the WCAG 2.0. Like I said, at our agency, we try to release all of our sites into the wild, so to speak, at 2.0 level AAA. That is always our goal. However, there's a few things that can thwart that goal. One of the first thing I'll tell you right up front, a lot of vendor widgets, embeddable slideshows, book widgets, book covers, rotating things, you know, a lot of widgets will break this fast. A lot of widgets that come from vendors are not accessible. So I'll warn you right up front about those. And we can't always control that. Sometimes our clients are like, we need this, we have to have it, it comes from our catalog. You know, so we release it as close as we can to AAA, but we have no control over those widgets that come from vendors. That's third-party content. The other thing here with this is that I really like about AC Checker is that you can show source. So it kind of in the third column, upper right, there's a little click box, checkbox that says show source. I always use that because what that does is it will show me exactly where in the code the problem is, so I'm not chasing it down to the ends of the proverbial code earth trying to find out where it lives. So this is very helpful for finding where stuff happens. So this is acchecker.ca. But again, not the only one, and not the only one that I even use. So another one that I use is called WebAIM. If you're not familiar, WebAIM is actually a nonprofit. They've worked for years to make the web more accessible. They've written software and disability simulators. They've shared in-depth surveys of users with disabilities. They've generally published more articles and resources than you can shake a stick at, which is one of the reasons that I use them, is they have so much stuff available, honestly, you know, to help us do our job a bit better. But one of the things, and they do a checker also that has a color contrast checker as well, which is one of the reasons I use WebAIM. I don't have a screenshot of that, but theirs goes a little further than just the standards. They also do color contrast, which is an important thing. But one of the things that WebAIM did at almost a year ago now is they published an accessibility analysis of the top 1 million homepages online, and the results, in a word, were abysmal. They were bad. So the real kicker for me in this survey is that they said this: automatically detectable errors constitute a small portion of all possible WCAG failures. So in other words, what that means, these are just the errors that can be detected by a programmatic checker like AC Checker or WebAIM or any of the others. The real picture is even worse than the numbers suggest. Accessibility online right now overall is abysmal. And again, these court cases are going to continue to proceed because of that, because so many people are being locked out of important services. Their library, hopefully not one of them. Okay. Moving right along here. So this is that part where I told you I don't want you to get scared. So we're going to talk a little bit of HTML, and if you haven't seen it since maybe library school, that's okay. There's my tagline. The basic HTML course you probably didn't, that you had probably didn't cover this stuff, but it really should have. This is important stuff. So the very first thing that I want to talk about, and we're going to be watching that 1-minute video that Jamie mentioned earlier in just a minute. So but don't do it yet, because I want to talk about this before you see the video so it makes a little sense to you. So the very first and probably one of the most often talked about things when we start talking about simple changes that you can make is the alt attribute. So here is an image tag. So if you've never seen this before, the tag says IMG, so this is an image that's going to be shown. If someone's blind or visually impaired in some way, they can't see that. Now this src attribute equals dog.jpg. So if that's just tells the browser, hey, this is what we're showing is dog.jpg. The next piece is what matters. It's alt equals, alt is short for alternative text. Alt equals young boy reading a children's book to a therapy dog. Now, without that alt attribute, there is literally nothing for someone who is using a screen reader, because remember, a lot of people using assistive technology for the web, a lot of them will be using a screen reader, which is literally reading the site to them. We're going to talk more about at least one of those a little bit later on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into the chat, if I can see it. There we go.
Actually, Jean can put it in the chat for you.
Okay. Thank you, Jean. If you would put that in the chat, I'm going to be quiet for just a minute.
All right, so go ahead, click on the link that Jean just posted in the question box. I'm going to set the timer to about 70 seconds, and we'll be back in about 70. So go ahead and watch that video that was shared. All right, hopefully that video is wrapping up for you. Laura, we are on 70 seconds right now.
Okay. I have to start my slideshow again, I guess. Oh, no, I don't. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see that slide again.
We do.
Okay. So a question just came in from Valerie Magno. Should I change alt equals quote, quote, to alt equals decorative element? No. Actually, when something is purely decorative, it should be empty. It should be null. So don't change that. Don't put text in there. If it's like a bullet point, for example, someone doesn't actually need that. That's a decorative element. That's a really good question. Hopefully that video made it really clear to you. First of all, if you've never heard a screen reader before, that was your first interaction at all with one, then congratulations. They can be a little disconcerting. There's something where you definitely have to get used to them. But you can see what a difference it makes to have that alt attribute in there, because otherwise there's nothing. There's no context at all for someone who is using a screen reading device of any kind. So it's a really important but simple change. But even if you have one, moving on here, so even if you have one, there's a big difference between a good alt attribute and a not so good alt attribute. You know, first of all, you have to have the alt attribute. It has to exist, right? But then it's got to be good quality to boot. So you want to make sure that all meaningful images use these. So descriptive text is supplied for images. They have to convey information. So I've got a good example here up top and a bad example. at the bottom, referring to this picture of this very chilling out panda here. And you can see with a good example, it's not just, hey, panda. Well, that doesn't tell me. I mean, why is there a picture of a panda? Well, maybe this is about a meditation session. I don't know, or maybe you just want a fun picture of a panda. But you need to give some more information. And notice also, you don't need to say picture of, image of. You don't need that. Screen readers don't care about it, or they will say it themselves. You don't ever need to include that yourself. That's a question that often comes up. So keep your you don't have to write a paragraph or an essay about the image. You just want to give people enough context to understand why the image is there. One thing that often gets confused when I teach the alt attribute is people ask, well, when I mouse over the link, for example, or an image or whatever, I don't get a little pop-up. I thought that's what that was. No, that's a different attribute. It's called the title attribute. And you're seeing that in example right here. When you mouse over the events link, you see there's a little pop-up that says view all posts fixed under events. That's a title attribute, and that's for seeing people. That doesn't show up in any audio way for people using a screen reader or frankly any other kind of really assistive technology probably. It's just an additional little tooltip which is useful, but it has nothing to do with accessibility. There's nothing wrong with it, just understand that it is not the same thing and it doesn't do the same job. Another thing is another attribute here. We covered obviously alt text, alternative text, but is the Longdesc or long description tag. And this often comes into play. Actually, it's a attribute, not a tag. The tag is image. This attribute comes into often when you're looking at charts and graphs or maybe even spreadsheets, potentially all kinds of things. You know, because if you've got a pie graph here, you can see, notice this also has an alt attribute, right? So they know what it is right away when the screen reader hits it. But in order to get more information, because they can't see it, there's a text breakdown of that pie chart at graph.html. So it's used to create a link to a page where more detailed description information can be provided. So again, useful for charts and complex illustrations primarily. Don't forget that this exists and that it is also needed. You also want to use meaningful images. Now, if you've ever heard me talk about web stuff ever, you're probably sick of this soapbox. And if you haven't, get ready to get sick of my soapbox. I have been talking for years to libraries about the need to get this, pardon my French, crappy clip art off of websites. First of all, the thing I tell libraries first off the bat is that you do not want this kind of quality on your community organization site. You don't want the same kind of artwork on your library's website that my son used on his third grade book report. It is not a good look, and it doesn't make your organization look reputable. I know it's easy to get, but you don't want to use it anyway. Notice the difference here between the one on the left and the one on the right. The one on the right is an actual photo of something happening in a library, and there's probably some context there that's important, like, hey, we have a computer class, you know, or look at these teenagers enjoying the computers, or something that has to do with the library. The woman on the left is pushing a book cart, and it's a clip art image. There's no real use to that stuff. One of the things I always tell people when I'm talking about accessibility, or I'm talking, frankly, just about usability, or frankly, really clearly not pissing people off, pardon my French, is, you know, nobody likes this stuff. We're all busy. So don't tell me you need to jazz up your website with cutesy images, because nobody wants them. And you're also inconveniencing people who don't want them, whether they're visually impaired in any way or not. So that's the end of my soapbox, and you can call me Mean Laura, because I am. But you know, if you are going to have to use something like this, someone already asked that question, what should you be using? Like, say, not necessarily for the cutesy woman with the book cart, but like for a bullet point, or, you know, maybe you've got a little star image or something. Your alt attribute is going to be alt equals empty quotes. That's all it's going to be, because someone with a screen reader doesn't need to know that, frankly, and it's not useful information with any real context. But the best thing you can do for everybody, for usability, for accessibility, is get the stuff that doesn't matter off the website. And don't worry about jazzing stuff up, because it's just wasting everybody's bandwidth. Okay. How you size your fonts matters. It matters a good bit. So I've been doing this for a long time, and since the late 90s. Yeah, I'm old. Maybe that's why I'm so cranky. But back in the day, it used to be that we were told to space, and I saw another question come in, and I'll get to that in just a second, Janelle, just to basically make our fonts a specific size, and they were in pixels or points. And you'll still see these measurements used today, unfortunately. The problem with this, and why this is a problem for accessibility, is because pixels and points are both absolute measurement. So what happens is that when someone makes their text size bigger on their screen, it doesn't resize nearly as cleanly as if you use a relative measurement. So if you look at the two examples in green on the bottom, the good ones, font size 1.3 em or 0.78 em. Rem is another one you can use. It's relative. But an M, basically what this says is that the font size for this element, whatever it is going to be, 1.3 times bigger than the base. So it's just saying, hey, if somebody makes their text bigger, make it 1.3 times, or doesn't make their bigger, size it at 1.3 times the base, and then because it's a relative measurement, this is really hard for me to explain. Because it's a relative measurement, it sizes more cleanly because it's basically doing some math. It's not trying to take some pixels and make them bigger or some points and make them bigger. It's doing math so that it scales up cleanly. It's more like a vector image for those of you who might be familiar with that. And the question I saw come in, what kind of images do you recommend using for card catalogs image links? Janelle, I think I might need more information there because when you say links, I don't think images. So then it sounds like you have a specific use case in mind. So if you can provide some additional information, I will try my best to answer that. Meaningful link text is another thing that helps everyone. And again, I'm old, so and you may be too. Remember back in the days when we had to teach people what a hyperlink is, and maybe there's still people in your library who you are, but they're probably fewer and far between than they were 20 years ago. And so it was a thing. You were supposed to say, click here for, say, more bestsellers. But we don't need to do that anymore because pretty much, most people know at this point what a hyperlink is and how to operate it. So when you take out that extraneous text, that's less for people to deal with. And of course, just saying click here doesn't help someone using a screen reader because they don't know what they're going to get. It doesn't help people who aren't using a screen reader because they don't know what they're going to get. So instead of saying click here, say more bestsellers. Instead of saying click here for more bestsellers, just say more bestsellers. Simplifies life for everybody, and everybody gets more gets where they're going faster. So good for usability and accessibility. This is a tough one, and I totally get why this is tough, but if you're really interested in making your calendar accessible, this is something where you're going to have to focus a little bit of effort. So this is an older, I think, Evan's calendar screenshot, but it doesn't matter what it is because it kind of demonstrates the problem. So if you look at, say, Friday the 3rd, you can see there's like 1, 2, I'm counting, 1, 2, 3, 4 events right there at the top of Friday that all look exactly the same. And remember, even if you're not, if you don't have any kind of disability, you look at this and I don't know why these are different. There's no way to know that without actually clicking on them. And certainly someone who's using assistive technology and having this read to them is going to have difficulty because they're not going to understand why this is being read to them 4 times. They might actually think it's an error. So when you are creating multiple things like this, especially on the same day, it might help, maybe it's because these are at different locations. That's my guess, is that these are the same event, 4 different locations that day, which is fine, and that happens at libraries all the time, but it would help to put something like the location name in the name of the event so that someone who's having that read to them can distinguish what the difference is. Okay, and I saw another question come in. Is it more accessible? Oh, sorry. Do you recommend not using images? Okay, I think this refers to the catalog question. I think. I hope I've got that right.
It does.
Okay, thank you. I've got like a half an inch of chat space. So that's a good question. So, I know a lot of times libraries link, say, book covers to the catalog, and that's a really great way sometimes to get people interested in a book. Because let's be honest, we all judge books by their covers. We do, and of course our patrons do. So I'm not arguing with that at all. So I guess I would say, evaluate the use case. How important is it? Would I do all your links to the catalog that way? Maybe that's not your intent. I would not do it all that way. But again, this is why this gets hard, because let's say you have a list of titles, like here are the new titles in this collection this month. Here's the new bestsellers. Would you want to do book covers with those? Absolutely. At the very least, make sure that they've got appropriate alt attributes, and you can say, this is the book cover for whatever this bestseller is, at the very least. It doesn't mean you can't ever have images. You have to just evaluate how important they are for the use that you have, which is why I make such a big stink about using cutesy kind of non-relevant, non-important things, because ain't nobody got time for that. But book covers are something people actively seek. So that's why I say, think about why you're using it. So that's a good question, and I can't answer that for everybody. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about tables. So I've mentioned like 3 times already, I'm old. So way back in the day, and maybe some of you can join me in this misery, but way back in the day, you may remember that a lot of website layout was actually done in tables. And this is a very simple table here, by the way, where you can see you've got 2 columns, fruits and vegetables. You've got bananas and apples under the fruit column as rows. You've got celery and lettuce as vegetable rows in the vegetable column. It used to be that the only way you could lay out a website up until maybe the very early 2000s was like this, by literally putting stuff in table cells. I don't see that as much anymore, but I still see it enough to have to talk about it. So the problem with this, of course, is that makes sense visually for someone who can see. It makes no sense at all to put elements like pictures into tables for someone who can't see. Tables are meant for tabular data, and this is tabular data. This is why the simplest table I could make. You've got column fruit, you've got a column vegetables. This is data about which things are which things are fruit, which things are vegetables. But these tables are not intended to have images or other kinds of elements in them. They're meant for data. It's okay to use a table for data. That's exactly what they're intended for, but don't put other things in tables. How you mark up your table is also important. And if you've never seen this before, don't freak out. It's okay. Take this back to whoever works on your website. This will make a ton of sense. So when tables were, again, back in the day, it used to be that this was a very simple table on the left. Basically, you had a table tag, then a table row. You had table TDs, which were table cells, and that was pretty much it. But there's some new tags that have come along at the very least. And I want to point a couple of those out in case you haven't seen a table in the way. The first one is there's a summary attribute to the table tag now. You see that on the right-hand side with the green, where it says fruits and vegetable tables. And that helps people, again, because remember, someone using assistive technology doesn't necessarily, they can't see this. So in order to know what this table is about without having to read all the way through it, the table summary helps them. There's also a T-body tag. This is part of better structure, which has come along since HTML5. If you learned HTML 4.01 back in the day, 5.0 is a huge upgrade, and there's a lot more to it, which I will not go into today. But at the very least, make sure you get that table summary in there so that they don't have to wade through the entire table in order to find out what the table is about. I kind of rushed by this. I actually do have a screenshot of this. This is actually from the WebAIM checker as well, and actually the link directly to this part of it is right there. Contrast is really important. It's very trendy right now, for example, to have light gray text on white backgrounds, and that's not really usable even for the best of us, but it's very trendy. So what this does is it will tell you, you put in your foreground color, which is usually your text color, and the background color, and it will tell you what the contrast ratio is, and it will tell you right away whether you pass or fail either AA or AAA of the WCAG. So when you can use this when you're creating images. If you're creating images, especially with text, this is a great tool to use. You can use it, if you're not using black text on white, you want to make sure that whatever the contrast is good on whatever your copy text is. This is another great tool for that as well. And another question I just saw come in, do Excel spreadsheets export with markup? You know what? I honestly don't know. That is a really good question, Rebecca, and I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. And I'm looking above that. It looks like I missed another question, so hang on just a second. When is ARIA markup essential, and when is it discretionary? Accessibility advocates would probably tell you it's pretty essential, again, beyond the scope of today. I can't really go into ARIA, and honestly, if you're using a good content management system, I'm a big Drupal fan myself because it's built with accessibility at the core, for one reason why I'm a fan, but ARIA will often come with a good number of content management systems where it's built in and you don't have to worry about it so much, because trying to do it from scratch can be a little intimidating. Again, from a legal standpoint, ARIA is not at the point where, say, WCAG 2.0 is. It's not, at least as far as I know, it hasn't been the center of a court case, but it sure can't hurt. I don't know if that answers your question or not. It's just not quite, it's not quite the level of a standard yet. It's a nice thing to have. One last thing I want to share with you, and then I want to get to any questions maybe that I might have missed. You too can use a screen reader. So if you thought that your only exposure to a screen reader was maybe that little blurb of alt text that you got to hear in that video, you can use one too. And you might be thinking, well, Laura, JAWS is really expensive, and you would be right. JAWS is really expensive, but there is an open source version, or not version, but option for you. It's called NVDA, which is short for non-visual desktop access. Now, the thing you need to know, first of all, I'm sorry if you're a Mac or a Linux person, I apologize. There's not an open source version of this for those platforms, but it is available for Windows. It is not just for the browser. That's an important thing to understand here, because you probably will use it to test stuff in the browser, which is where a lot of work does happen. But you're going to find out very quickly when you use it, it reads everything in Windows that you're doing to you, because it assumes that you're blind or have some kind of visual impairment, and so it assumes that the only thing you do on your computer is not just browse the web. So be prepared for that once you install it. It does take a good bit of time to get familiar with it. It is, again, if you thought that little blurb was a little disconcerting, this is going to be a lot disconcerting. But it's a very eye-opening experience, so I heartily recommend it. Something also to be aware of as a visually abled user is that the page may not scroll while the reader is reading. So it'll be reading stuff to you that's not on the screen because it's looking at the code behind whatever it is. It's not looking at the screen because it doesn't care about that. So that can be a little disconcerting also when you first become acquainted with NVDA. And they do have a great getting started guide at WebAIM to NVDA. So if you install it and you go, oh my gosh, what did I just get myself into? This is a good place to kind of fall back to and get some more information so you can use it better. And here is this URL that I promised at the end, where there's a whole bunch of accessibility resources. There's more information on virtually everything that I've talked about today, along with yet more tools and accessibility checkers. And I don't know if there are any questions that I didn't get to, because I know I had that tiny little space, but I tried to keep up with them.
I think you got to most of them, Laura, and actually we are out of time. So
okay, cool.
If you're not able to get Laura's link down, remember the slides and the recording will be posted to our conference website later today, so you can get that. So thank you again, Laura, for a great session. Thank you to all of you for your questions. Those were really, really fantastic, and
yes,
you shared a lot of great information. So our next session, our final session in the Tech Trends track today, is on social media trends, and that's going to start at 2:30, so just in 30 minutes. We hope to see you at that session as well, and if not, we hope you have a great rest of your day. So long.